When somebody casts a vision, is there really a place for skepticism and challenging that once the vision's been set, or is that just being a killjoy?
This is the question of the hour. Will Wilkinson here.
And I'm Christopher Harding. We're here with Thriving in Business and Life, and we're really talking about this question of is assessing reality, does it get in the way of being able to really accomplish a vision that's bold?
Well, let's start with the word that you use, skepticism, and make a distinction between skepticism and cynicism. Because it really does make a difference. Now, skepticism, I find, can be extremely valuable. Skepticism basically is just questioning things.
Sure.
Whereas cynicism is a number of degrees beyond skepticism. It is implying a mindset that isn't really examining things so much in a questioning way as much as inserting an agenda that overpowers what's being seen or done.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. Good way to describe that. And it seems like with cynicism is something that's probably laden with some deep biases.
Well, yeah, I mean, an example of cynicism would be, you tell me something you're thinking of doing, and I say, well, that'll never work.
Right.
That's cynical. Now, skepticism would be, I'm not sure that would work.
Right. Have you thought about this?
Yeah.
Or what about that?
Yeah, so skepticism leaves room for discovery. Cynicism rules it out.
Yeah. Well, and as we were talking last week about using the imagination and casting vision and really living into that vision. And a lot of times, I think we may tend to err on one side or the other of this equation. I'm so focused on my vision that I ignore what's right in front of me,
right,
or maybe don't see obstacles that could be in my way. On the other side, even being skeptical in a healthy way, if I stay in skepticism mode, I might actually lose sight and you could say the impetus or power of a vision. So how do we maintain that balance, and is there a time for each?
Well, yes, I think there is. I think we have to kind of back up and take a big view and acknowledge that in our culture we're dealing with an epidemic of adrenal exhaustion.
Gosh, yes.
That people are so driven, often by a vision, and they're not really pausing to assess. It's like pedal to the metal. And this mode is celebrated. It's the superachiever who doesn't let anything get in their way. They're not really pausing to assess anything. Skepticism is being a killjoy, right?
It's viewed that way, sure.
It's viewed that way. And this is where results get so warped, because often a person will be celebrated for their wonderful achievements, which they've done through adrenal exhaustion, in other words,
of themselves and others.
Yeah. And yet, if you examine their lives, there's many failures, often in relationship, often in health, and we're shocked when a superachiever commits suicide.
Right.
And we look at them and say they had everything. They had millions of dollars, they had fame, they had recognition, they had the trophy partner. How could they end their life? Well, they ended their life because it wasn't working.
Yeah. Well, that's a real, I guess you could say, reality check that we can all take a look at. And as we create a vision, as we were talking last week about, creating a vision, whether it's short-term or long-term, and really being able to see it, say it, and describe it in other words from the future, as if we were looking back to really see it and sense it and then feel what it would feel like to have that success. As we're doing that probably isn't the time to introduce skepticism.
Well, I don't think it's the time to introduce skepticism because, as we've used the term killjoy, or, you're raining on the parade, etc. However, it is the time to be especially alert, because what I'm looking for when I, cast a vision, when I look ahead and imagine some success, is I'm looking for realism. Now, that may seem like an odd combination, realism and vision. But I want my expectation, my anticipation, my visionary hopes and dreams to be realistic. And if they're realistic, they're going to contain some element that's negative, because nothing is 100% positive. Only an imagination, and by that I mean imagination that's divorced from reality. So when I come up with some vision, I have a new book coming out. I'm getting the proof of it in a couple of days. I'm very excited about the new book. When I vision its success, I'm also including the very real possibility that there will be some readers who don't like it.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Now, that's different than skepticism in the way we're kind of framing it. I'm not being less than confident about what I'm visioning. I'm being realistic. The odds are really good that there will be at least a few readers who don't like that new book.
Well, yeah, so that's I was reading something. I wish I could remember the author's name. I'd love to give him credit for it. But he basically was saying, when you're doing this future casting, this vision casting, and you get that feeling and you're really soaking in it and so on, as you're done with that process, go back again. Only now say, standing from where I'm standing now, how does that future vision feel? What am I noticing? Am I feeling concerned? Or am I realizing there's things I haven't thought of? There's obstacles in the way? Am I anxious? And it was really an interesting counterbalance, you could say, is go ahead and lean into the vision and feel all that success in a realistic way, like you said, and then come back and assess now.
Well, you're reminding me of Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats process.
Right.
Where I thought very cleverly he advised you put on a different color hat for whatever phase of a creative process you're in. When we're brainstorming, we don't really want the negativity. It's a matter of timing. And I think if we have an agreement that we're going to get to the negativity, we're going to assess what could go wrong, that frees us to go 100% into I think that was his white hat or his blue hat, where you really got creative about what could go perfectly right.
Yeah, well, and as you're saying that, I think, you've run brainstorming sessions, so have I. We've participated in them. And having the willingness, the discipline, the agreement, as you said, to say, if you have some skepticism pop up, great, make note of it, and we'll save that for later when we review what could go wrong or why wouldn't this work. Yeah. And it seems like a lot of times, if we're skeptical, not cynical, and we bring up some of those, questions or objections, etc., concerns, that actually could fuel creativity if we're truly,
absolutely,
bought into the vision.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's this fine line is if I'm leading and we've created a vision together and somebody starts to get skeptical after the fact, how do I interpret that? What's the story I make up about their skepticism? Yeah. Am I saying, wow, this person's a problem, they're not bought in? Or am I saying, wow, I'm glad this person is asking these hard questions because they're going to help make sure that we find out the potholes in the road before we hit them?
That's excellent. I find myself engaged in those kinds of conversations quite often. And that's the one side of it, which is kind of leveraging the value in what is contributed. So you have a bright idea, the person you share it with has a critical comment, so you harvest the value in their critical comment. That's one part of it. Another part of it is educating each other on the right timing.
Right.
Because when I'm in the throes of a hubris-laden, grandiose vision of some kind, I want to enjoy that a little bit.
Right.
I am going to yard it back in. I'm going to get practical. I'm going to do my assessment, and I want help to do that. But when I'm feeling that ebullient explosion of creativity, I don't want to limit that because I don't know where it's going and I want to find out. So I'll sometimes say to a person, thank you for that comment. Would you be okay if we just held that to the side for right now and stayed with this wild imaginative thinking for a little longer, would that be all right with you?
Yeah. Well, and that acknowledges them for their contribution, but like you said, starts to create a sense of what's the best timing for things like this. I remember in some of the work I did with Toyota, the process they had of creating buy-in was that they very early on would start to have conversations about the vision around something early on before it had been publicly pronounced and so on. And their whole idea was to get people to think of, wow, this would be great, and what needs to happen in order for this to work. And by the time they'd go around everybody who was going to be involved in bringing that to be, or who would be impacted by it, when they finally were ready to make the real visionary pronouncement, it had been one where they had assessed reality before they actually formally launched the full-on vision.
Well, that's so intelligent, because there's a fundamental difference between, creativity plus skepticism and creativity plus questions around implementation.
Right.
That's fundamentally different approaches. They may seem the same, but one of them is productive and the other one is kind of like point, counterpoint, getting nowhere.
Yeah. And we've talked about that before. If we allow our need to be right to supersede our willingness to create a solution, we get into that point, counterpoint kind of a conversation. And I was watching a program last night. It was actually about songwriters, and it was where songwriters come in and pitch their song to famous artists, and the artists decide which song they want to use. And what was really interesting, of course, the people were coming in with this treasured creation that they had,
which they had a little bit of investment in, right?
Yeah, just a bit. And it was so great to watch each one of them as, in this case, it was Will.i.am, amazingly talented producer and artist and songwriter himself, start to offer suggestions. And have you thought about this? Or what if we did that? And like one person was, you could see them kind of caught off guard, almost like, what? Like change my my creation. And another one was leaning into it going, oh, wow, yeah, I love that, And it was the whole what you saw, and they kind of took them through the process of learning how to collaborate. And what it seems like with vision casting and assessing the current situation, especially with others involved, is it creates this awesome opportunity for us to collaborate and make something that might have been really good even better.
Well, that's the point of collaborating. We can do better together than we do on our own. Again, there's a lot of nuance to this, because there's different levels of creation. We can show up with something that is highly polished, at least in our own mind,
right,
or something that's, obviously a work in progress. And depending on what we kind of present for a collaboration, it will elicit different kinds of feedback. If something is polished and, has been carefully worked, even though it can benefit from input from others, there's a respect due to that isn't warranted as much with something that's kind of just tossed on the table as early thinking. And I think that's one of the problems is that somebody will be exposed to someone else's work and not show them the kind of respect they deserve for what they're presenting. And so then the other person gets offended. I've worked on this for 10 years. How can you just, in 30 seconds, tell me to revise the whole second act? Which is really justifiable.
Sure.
I think the person listening is going to get much further in their collaboration if they kind of take time to digest what's there and show it some respect before they plunge in with their bright ideas.
Well, yeah. I mean, and you talked about timing. I mean, it's the whole idea of to know when to provide feedback, when not to, and how to provide it in a constructive way versus a cynical way. I mean, all of those are the nuances you're talking about.
I mean, I just was watching a stand-up comedian online, and it was a woman actually, she mentioned, doing a show and walking off stage and getting some feedback from someone right away that was negative. And she said, yeah, that's exactly when I want to hear that. And any of us who've done anything on stage know that that's not good timing. You're in kind of a vulnerable state. You've used a lot of energy. You've taken some risks. You do not want to immediately hear how you screwed up.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it was kind of curious. The other day we were having a coaching conversation with a person, because their own, you could say, value or ethic was, the truth is the truth, and it doesn't matter when I deliver it and to whom.
Okay.
All right. So, I mean, on one hand, as a lover of truth, that was their sense. And so the way it played out was that somebody was in a very vulnerable place, and they told them something that was, kind of devastating, especially because of how it was delivered. It was just delivered kind of flatly, baldly, at a real vulnerable time. And so what we're talking about in the coaching was coupling truth with grace.
Yeah, right.
Which is all about timing and sensitivity to somebody's state, and how can I deliver the same exact information in a way that it's better received. Taking a look at the difference between intent. Their intent was to be truthful and to share what was important, and to also look at the other side of it as impact. How did it land?
Well, and I think I'd question a little bit the absoluteness of what you just said, which in a situation which for me is hypothetical because I wasn't there. I agree that the intention can be to contribute and increase value, but, being realistic, often there's another program running which relates to ego inflation.
And being right, maybe.
You show me yours, I'll show you mine kind of thing.
Right.
Here's your great creative work. Well, I'm going to improve on it and increase my value in doing that. So I think there's some personal vigilance that can come into play here. Why am I saying what I'm saying? Is it through a genuine interest to help this other person who I may embrace as my creative brother or sister, or is it some kind of even subtle one-upmanship?
Yeah, or sabotage, maybe, even if we took it further, you know. And I think the question, you phrased it really well, and I've heard it said another way that kind of sticks with me as well. I am doing this in service of what and whom.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, if I'm really doing it in service of that other person, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish with them? What is it I'm trying to present? And therefore, if that's the case, what would be the best way?
Right. What a great thought process, what you just led us through there. I gave an address the other morning to a graduating class for high school in a nearby town here, and I quoted Buckminster Fuller, this beautiful quote of his. Actually, it was a very traumatic time in his life. I'm sure most of our listeners are aware of who Buckminster Fuller was, considered one of the greatest inventors, thinkers of the 20th century. Well, his daughter died unexpectedly, and he was devastated, and he waded out into Lake Michigan with the intention of killing himself, ending his life. And apparently, he got out there and had this major epiphany where he actually heard a voice speaking to him inside. He recorded it later for others to hear, and as near as I can remember, it was something like this: your life does not belong to you. You can never know your own value relating to yourself, but you can know it if you convert all your experiences for the benefit of others. There were a number of people in the audience who asked me about this quote later. They were really impressed. They wanted to get the right wording. And the phrase that they really liked was converting personal experiences for the benefits of others. Now, often it's for the benefit of myself.
Right, sure.
My personal experience now is a story I can share. It can inflate me. It can prove my value. But what a brilliant insight that I can never really know my own value on my own. I know it in relationship to my service to others through converting my personal experience for their benefit.
Well, wow, what a higher higher way to view one's life and experiences and service. As we're saying this and we're talking about assessment, a lot of what we're talking about is assessment and how it comes from others and how we can collaborate and so on. Another part of it too that seems to strike me that I run into with various clients is just the whole notion of what other people think.
Right, a big one.
Yeah, so that's a certain type of assessment, and I've watched some people who I know from having worked with them are talented and brilliant and have some wonderful capacity, actually pull themselves over to the side of the road, metaphorically, and give up on their idea, give up on themselves in many ways, because there are other people in their life who are highly critical of them. Mm-hmm. So as we assess the current situation, assess reality as compared to maybe a vision or a goal we have, part of it, I think, is also important to really pay attention to who are we listening to.
Well, yes, I remember a story about Yogi Berra, the baseball player, and he'd given some advice to another ball player, and apparently it wasn't very good advice, and the guy didn't take it, and Yogi asked why not, and he said, well, you always have to consider the source. I mean, it's a little harsh, but for instance, there are a lot of pundits who make their living giving advice on television.
Right.
And if you really look at their track record, a lot of them have been dead wrong most of the time.
Yeah, you were talking about Charles Barkley the other day and how, in spite of his predictions, people keep listening to him.
Yeah, and politically, this is even more obvious, where track records stretching back decades are littered with abject failure of perception and decision-making, and yet there's still a credibility afforded to these people because they've written books and they've got a Harvard education. It's always important to check the source. Well,
and part of it, I think, sometimes for people is it's one thing to have some, person I don't know have a different opinion than me and have a pundit, for example. It's another thing if it's somebody in my life, right, somebody close to me. I was talking to a young woman the other day who's just continues to do amazing, marvelous things in service of others, to your point about Buckminster Fuller. And one thing that was always just subtly undermining her, she would push through it, but it was undermining her, was she had a couple of family members that were just really wanted to reinforce what an insufficient person she was, and how they couldn't even imagine why she would dare try some of the things she was trying, because she was such a loser. I mean, those are my words, not theirs, right, but that was the essence of what they were telling her.
Sure.
And the internal determination and decisions she had to make to consider the source and say, those are people who are choosing for now, in their experience, and it might be the way they're always going to see me, to never believe in me.
Well, yeah, and we have people like that who will pull us down if they can. Why is that? I mean, there's always a number of reasons for everything, but someone who's in your family, a close friend, even a partner, is close enough to be threatened by your success. Because if they're stuck, if they're not stepping up in their own lives the way they know they could, even if they don't admit it to anyone else or darely glance at it themselves, you doing that, you going for it, is going to threaten them, and it's going to remind them of how guilty they feel and ashamed of not doing it themselves. So their reaction will be to tear you down, because misery loves company.
As we're talking about that, I've been reading a book that was referred to me by a common friend of ours, John Schleining, who's a Reichian therapist.
Right.
And one of the things that he talks about, and it talks about in the book, is that the belief, or the theory, you could say, of that particular type of therapy is the belief that all of us at our core are just these amazing, you could say, manifestations of life.
Yeah.
And that when we get injured or hurt when we're young, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, we tend to start shutting down. And so when other people see someone who's breaking out of that and going for it and starting to live out their full potential, it actually feels, as you said, threatening.
Sure.
And their natural tendency is to try to pull that person down so that they can feel comfortable again in their own limited way of being.
Well, I have a remedy for this.
Oh, good. Let's hear it.
Because this can be such a challenge. And it's simply that I believe, and I have a lot of proof to back this up, that life is fundamentally benevolent. And that whatever shows up in any moment, including criticism from someone we respect and love, is exactly what we need in that moment for our own advancement. Now that's a story I've decided to tell.
Sure.
And I've proven that out over and over again. And I've gotten some pretty heavy-duty criticism for some of my creating over the years, and it has been tough. I'm not suggesting that this remedy suddenly resolves the feeling reaction of shame or anger or disappointment in oneself, etc., but it is a conceptual overlay. It's a perspective that renders value from everything. So, this new book comes out, someone says, this is the worst book I've read in years. How do I harvest some value from that?
Right.
See, that attitude takes me away from, well, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. What's wrong with them? What's wrong with me? It's just, I am here in every circumstance to find the value. And sometimes that's harder to find than other times. Sometimes my ego gets shattered. Well, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing, really, if I'm, hoping to move at some point into a relatively egoless state. So that could even be a blessing.
As you're saying that, it just really reminds me that what you were talking about is you created a story. You created a frame, like you said.
Yeah.
And so that's a choice.
Yeah.
Since we're making up stories and we're interpreting things all the time, you've chosen to see criticism or feedback in that way.
Right.
And because you have, it enables you to actually look for the nuggets, in the midst of the criticism.
Right.
And that, I think it's again, when we talk about vision and in service of what and how are we receiving feedback, part of it is, I can't control how other people give me feedback. I can ask, I can try to influence, but to your point, I can always decide how I'm going to interpret it and what I'm going to make it mean.
Well, exactly. And let's bring up something that's been obvious to me in the conversation, although we haven't used the word, which is our concept of pendulation.
Right.
Where we really invite people to swing into the vision and swing back into the current reality. Imagine, if we can think back to being a child on a swing, if we're not moving. It's not very much fun. We like to get pushed.
Right.
Swing this way, swing that way. So if I'm communicating with someone and they give me some negative feedback, my attitude is they just gave me a push. They pushed me in the opposite direction I was going. I was all enthusiastic. They're pushing back and they're saying, well, I don't really like your book. They're pushing me in the other direction. I'm now pendulating between the vision and the current reality, which is that I'm getting some tough love feedback. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm swinging. I'm enjoying the motion.
Yeah, well, again, it's all in how you decide to frame it.
Yeah.
So, this is, we've gone down a little bit different road with this topic than we have before, which is always helpful for me. It gets me thinking in a different way.
Yeah, me too.
So, if you have your own sense of assessing reality and how to collaborate and critique and so forth, please write us and share that with us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson, loving these conversations, not just with Chris, but with anybody who writes in and lets us know and contributes their thoughts. So we'll see you again next program.